Israel has proposed a new deal for a ceasefire in Gaza. U.S. President Joe Biden presented the plan today.
It's time to begin this new stage. For the hostages to come home, for Israel to be secure, for the suffering to stop. It's time for this war to end, for the day after to begin.
The proposal comes after months of talks mediated by the U.S., Egypt, Qatar, and other countries in the region. It's made up of 3 phases. The first phase puts in place a 6-week temporary ceasefire. And during this time, Israeli forces would withdraw from the populated areas of Gaza. Phase 2 will come after more negotiations between Israel and Hamas, but would eventually lead to a permanent ceasefire, and Israeli forces will completely withdraw from Gaza, and all remaining Israeli hostages will be released by Hamas. The final phase, phase 3, includes the major reconstruction of Gaza, and Biden did not clarify how long that phase could take. In a statement, Hamas said it views positively what was included in the U.S. President Joe Biden's speech today. So, is a ceasefire deal possibly around the corner in the Israel-Hamas war? John Allen is Canada's former ambassador to Israel, and Arif Lalani is Canada's former ambassador to Jordan, Iraq, and the United Arab Emirates. Gentlemen, it's really good to see you. John, let's start with you if we can. This ceasefire proposal from Israel less than a month after the last sort of talks fell apart. What do you make of this move and the response from Hamas?
Well, it's the best news we have seen in the Middle East since the last ceasefire, and I hope that it will stick. There seems to be positive movement on all fronts. Israel puts it forward. Joe Biden announces it, on national television, and Hamas seems to agree that it has the makings of a deal. The devil is always in the details, and that second phase, when they have to negotiate the permanent ceasefire, could be difficult, and we don't know how it's going to go. But if they can at least release the first batch of hostages and have a ceasefire, a temporary ceasefire, and begin movement towards a permanent ceasefire, this will be terrific. It'll be terrific for Palestinians who are suffering. It'll be terrific for Israelis and, of course, the hostages. And it'll be good for Joe Biden, frankly, who needs to get this issue off the Democratic platform and the criticism that he's receiving.
Arif, how do you see this? Hamas, its statement was at least positive on the surface level. We've got reports that Antony Blinken, the Secretary of State, has been speaking with the foreign ministers of Turkey, Jordan, and Saudi Arabia today. So there is a diplomatic push going on across the region. How do you think this is be viewed?
Well, I think it is very important. And I think it's very interesting because the agreement, as the Americans have said, or the proposal, is pretty similar to what the Egyptians publicly proposed a couple of weeks ago, and Hamas agreed, and then Israel hadn't agreed to parts of it. So I think it's important that now you have Israel proposing virtually the same agreement, waiting for Hamas to agree. And I think it's really important that President Biden, it's the Americans that are making the pitch. Diplomatically, I think that's designed to let both sides agree. So I think that's interesting. I think the second thing that's very interesting here is the American president, trying to speak directly to Israelis and Israeli leaders and Israeli citizens, saying, you need to accept this. This is, the last best effort here. And so I worry a little bit. We've been here before. About 3 or 4 months ago in this conflict, President Biden, I think it was also on a Friday, said that a ceasefire agreement was close and he thought it would be there by Monday. And of course, it didn't happen. So I'm very cautious. I think this could all unravel again, but clearly it seems that there is a deal that's close to being finalized here.
Yeah, John, like Arif, I was very cautious in jumping to firm conclusions on this because we've been there before, right? We saw alerts come out and say, oh, Hamas agrees it's a ceasefire, and then within an hour, as though Israel says that's not what we talked about. But this one, what we've seen from Netanyahu, what we've seen from Hamas, what we've heard from Biden, European leaders are weighing in on this in a very positive way. But as Arif says, this is very similar to what was there before. What do you think would have changed in Israel to get to this point, that the Israelis would suddenly be willing, they've gone so far into Rafah, that they would be willing to agree to something like this or propose something like this?
Well, a couple of things, perhaps. I mean, I don't have a crystal ball. One of the things is that they are far deep into Rafah. They've taken over the Philadelphia corridor. Maybe they are coming to the conclusion that they have significantly dealt a blow to Hamas. Biden alluded to that in his remarks. The other thing is that the protests in Israel have been growing larger and larger. The demands for the hostage release are increasing, and we've now seen Gantz demanding that the Knesset fold and they move to elections. The Minister of Defense has been critical of Bibi Netanyahu for not having a plan for the day after. And the Americans are clearly unhappy with the progress. The horrible incident in Rafah where 45 people were burned and 250 were injured. This is a whole set of factors coming together, putting some pressure on Israel to try and move to an end to this conflict.
Yeah, Arif, just to pick up on a point there that John mentioned and that President Biden said today, that Hamas can't do what it did on October 7th anymore. And I know Netanyahu's stated goal was the eradication of Hamas, which we've discussed is kind of impossible to do to the last fighter. But is that his way of saying the capacity has been eradicated and therefore saying to the world that what Netanyahu set out to do, he has accomplished, and that shouldn't be considered an obstacle to go for peace now?
Yes, I think that is an important point. I think the American president is basically pronouncing or giving, a way out for the Israeli prime minister to say, look, we have judged. I am judging that the capabilities have been diminished or eradicated. So I think that that's a really important point. I do think the devil is in the details here, as John was saying. It's not quite clear what withdrawing from populated areas is going to mean. It's not clear what a permanent ceasefire is going to mean, and a number of other things. So, but I do think it's a moment of truth. Everybody, in some ways, is running out of time. It is 6 months now. Your segment before was about a fixed election date in Canada. There's a fixed election date in the US. So President Biden is highly motivated, I think, to arrive at an agreement, not just on this ceasefire, but a broader agreement for regional peace. Prime Minister Netanyahu has his own issues with domestic trials and public opinion. And I would also observe that agreeing to this ceasefire would also have the outcome that it would negate or at least diminish the challenge from the International Court of Justice. It's a way, in some ways, to comply with the rulings of the Court of Justice without actually doing so explicitly.
Well, John, it's interesting too. Like Arif talks about how people are running out of time, but increasingly the international community is running out of patience with Israel, right? And we had one of Mr. Netanyahu's advisors this week saying, "Oh, fighting could go on in Rafah or in Gaza until the end of the year." And I don't see how, with more and more countries, recognizing the Palestinian state and the increased pressure, it could go that long. I wonder how much you think all of those factors have maybe changed the Israeli thinking here.
I think Arif is 100% right. You've got the ICC ruling against Netanyahu and Gallant. You've got the International Court of Justice on a genocide case, the last thing the Israelis would want a verdict on. And as you mentioned, you've got recognition by 3 Western countries, probably with more to come in the next little while. So this is all pressure that is finally being brought to bear. And frankly, it's the kind of pressure, certainly on the recognition side and on the settlement side, that should have been brought to bear for a long time. Yes, I agree. I think those are other pressures that Bibi Netanyahu is feeling, and that the government in general is feeling. I guess the one of the factors we haven't talked about yet is Ben Gvir and Smotrich, who of course have said that if you move towards any kind of ceasefire, and they don't care about the hostages, then we're threatening to leave the government. And of course, as Arif mentioned, Biden alluded to that. He's aware of the pressures on Bibi, and it'll be interesting to see what happens in the next couple of days, whether they do threaten to leave the coalition, and then the government falls and there has to be elections. They may not want that because, of course, the polls suggest that Bibi would lose,
Right.
and the coalition would lose an election. Although I must say that Bibi's numbers are actually going up a bit, and he is actually ahead in the polls in terms of who would make a better prime minister, if you can believe it, in a recent Israeli poll.
So, Arif, we're just getting to the end of our time, but there's an optimism, but obviously a skepticism on this. I think we have to be cautious about, assuming anything in this conflict. But what are you watching for next in the next 24, 48, 72 hours on where this may go, to give us a signal on how hopeful people should be that this could be nearing at least a ceasefire?
Well, I think the ball has very clearly been put in Hamas's court now. I mean, will they agree to essentially what they had agreed to a couple of weeks ago? And will the Israelis stand behind their proposal? So I think there is a way out for everybody here to say, look, the guns have done their job, at least for now, and it's time for diplomacy and humanitarian work to really proceed. But I also worry that a few days pass and nothing happens. People get bogged down in some details. We've seen that before, and it's not impossible that we may be there again.
Okay, gentlemen, I always appreciate the time and the insight. I'm sure we'll be reaching out to you again soon. John Allen, Arif Lalani, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you.
Thanks, David.